given these housekeeping items, now we're ready to get a little more into today's topic. So we've chosen Douglas Kelly, my colleague here, to present on the topic of training under the new cybersecurity regulations introduced by the New York Department of Financial Services. We had already done an event about this topic in mid-December last year, December 2016, when the regulations were still just in the process of being reviewed. And so we thought we would run another event now that they have actually come into force and they've become effective, so that we'd provide an update to the people who attended last time. But by all means, this event is also intended to be as a standalone. So if you haven't participated in the first webinar, this is perfect for you as well, as we'll be going through the whole content and giving you a little more perspective. So again, as I mentioned, Douglas Kelly is here with me. Douglas is the head of legal editorial here at EverFi. He's a licensed attorney who's passionate about organizational culture, ethical decision-making, and anti-corruption, and as well as data security, which is another topic that he focuses on from the corporate compliance side here at EverFi, and also writes regularly about all of these topics on our blog, which is blog.lawroom.com. So, given this introduction, Douglas, now I'd like to hand it off to you so you can dive us into today's topic and tell us more about what's going on in New York.
Terrific. Thank you, Michaela. I'm here to talk about the new cybersecurity regulation that is now effective in New York. I'm going to only touch on final changes to the regulation, then really hone in on the training component. Compliance training is our specialty, so we have a lot to offer here. And then housekeeping of my own, I am a lawyer and talking about legal stuff, so I have to say that I cannot give legal advice, and none of what I talk about today should be considered legal advice. I advise you to ask your in-house counsel or outside counsel. All right, so let's get started. As many of you know, the regulation is released by the Department of Financial Services and requires covered entities to implement various cybersecurity functions into their business. It applies to any business operating under New York's banking, insurance, or financial services laws. This includes banks, insurance companies, and financial houses. National banks and federal savings banks don't have to comply with this regulation, but it's actually plausible if they're an affiliate of a New York-based company, just looking at the bare language. This is something you should be well apprised of by now, but I wanted to highlight that. Exemptions. So the biggest change from the previous versions that we've seen was the addition of many more exemptions. This allows mostly smaller financial services companies to not have to comply with the majority of the regulation. So I just want to cover this briefly. I think it's important. You can see the most impactful changes on the slides that have happened as a result of the final regs. There's also more obscure exemptions made clear by the regulation itself. I recommend going into it and looking for those. It's not worth webinar time to go over them. But hopefully these exemptions had an effect, as smaller institutions tend to have a lack of resources. More companies are likely more exempt now because of these. But the big takeaway, however, is to know that an exemption doesn't get you off the hook for implementing a cybersecurity program or policies. And I honestly don't think this is a bad thing. Policies and programs are critical for any business to have, a point I'm going to be making throughout the presentation. An overview. Much of the proposed language has been tweaked slightly since the two prior versions to afford companies more flexibility. The big requirements, however, remain the same. As mentioned, a company has to develop a cybersecurity program. So it's not unlike the programs recommended by NIST and the FFIEC. They require you to identify protected information, assess, address, maintain security, and plan in the event of a data breach. Policies are also required, 4 to be exact. A company must have a main cybersecurity policy that discusses 14 separate subjects, an incident response plan, a policy governing third-party relationships, and that latter part is really important for the upcoming GDPR. And finally, the fourth policy is a security policy for any applications you develop in-house. Banks must also have a CISO and enough personnel to make their cybersecurity program effective. That's the personnel component. Additionally, companies must engage in a variety of security processes in various forms and functions, such as performing a risk assessment, which informs the updates to your cybersecurity program. This is where a lot of the other minor changes happen. Things like risk assessments got easier. For example, vulnerability testing doesn't have to be done periodically if it's not necessary. You're not testing things because the rules tell you. Now, because of these final changes, you're engaging in things because your personal assessment of the company determined that you should. This makes things more flexible for you. And then finally, the regulations require banks and insurance companies to provide cybersecurity training to a variety of personnel. This is the focus of the webinar, and we have some really great stuff for you. What's in the news? So as a researcher, I track compliance thought leadership and updates. Even though the regulation is mandatory, and this is something you have to do, it's helpful to provide context. This is how I approach compliance really in general, is I want to translate it to make it work for your business operations. Out of all industries, the banking industry is spending the most money on data security, $8.8 billion to be exact. While this number includes more than just New York companies, I think knowing what competitors are doing can provide benchmarks for conduct. People are really investing in this. Additionally, CNN recently reported that North Korean nationals have hacked a slew of banks in non-US countries. And I bring this up not to scare anybody or to suggest that North Korea is going to be after you, but really to provide why cybersecurity isn't going away, especially in this globalized society we live in, where businesses are increasingly impacted by geopolitics. And then finally, the National Law Review named cybersecurity as the #4 most important issue to tackle in 2017. I like this article because if you click on it, it'll describe generally what firms must do and make cybersecurity a business risk and not just a compliance risk. And I think that's a really important distinction as we go throughout analyzing the impact of these regulations. And so we have our first poll question of the day for you all. Michaela?
Right, so we wanted to ask, just to get a feel of what the, how this topic is being perceived over on the ground from the people in the audience today. We have a mixed audience with people all across the board, from IT to legal and institutions of financial institutions of different size. So we wanted to know, do you feel you've identified the biggest risk to your company's cybersecurity for 2017? And this is just a yes or a no question. So I'm going to initiate the poll right now and let you vote. Here it is flashing on your screen. So have you identified the biggest risk to your company's cybersecurity in 2017? You're now able to vote. We're going to allow a couple seconds for all the people who want to express their votes.
And I also want to add, folks, that the regulations don't require a risk assessment to be performed until next year, March 2018. So no shame or worry, just an honest response. It's okay if it's yes or no.
Okay, great. So I'm going to close this off, Douglas, and we can look at the results. Displaying them right now. So,
Correct.
Overwhelming yes, I see.
Yeah, so we have 83% of you saying that yes, you have identified your company's biggest risk. And then 17% of you said no. And again, that's perfectly fine. Sometimes it takes 6 months to a year to identify these very specific things when digging into your entire company's operation. So that's really interesting. Thank you, folks, for answering that. I'm going to click back to our presentation and continue. Terrific. So the training requirement. The regulation really requires two kinds of training here. First, you must provide cybersecurity personnel. These are really your experts with updates and training sufficient to address the risks that come up as part of your own cybersecurity program. You need to feed the experts, so to speak. Include them into your business, into the operations, any changes in assessments. They're really your core team. Second, you must provide regular cybersecurity awareness training to all personnel. The training must be updated to reflect the risks identified by that risk assessment. I mentioned that before. That's something you need to perform periodically to determine if there's any new vulnerabilities or risks. And that's going to determine future training. Additionally, you must provide training by March 1st, 2018. That is less than 1 year. And what's fascinating to me is the little amount of press this training requirement got. Effective training isn't as easy as you think, and so that's really why we wanted to do this webinar, is to tell you best practices and how to effectively roll out training, because we think it's very important. Ever the nerd, I wanted to try and tackle this language for you and break down their training requirement because it's not defined by the DFS. I like starting simple. Merriam-Webster has 5 definitions of regular, but I think the most accurate definition is something of reoccurring. Regular means reoccurring or functioning at fixed, uniform, or normal intervals. And this is, I think this is correct because if we look at other language in the regulation, we see that periodic is used for risk assessment, and a vulnerability assessment needs to be performed biannually. So all of this language suggests to me that when it says regular cybersecurity training, it's temporal. It's something that needs to be provided consistently, either every year or twice every year. Because we also see that while it has to be updated to reflect any new risks, that's sort of like a separate clause in the regulatory language. And so this is what I would suggest is, regardless of whether there's any new updates, you need to provide training on a very regular basis. And if it helps, Verizon talks about ongoing training when talking about the importance of employees keeping hard assets like computers and phones secure. And so I really like the data breach investigations report. I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. They say that ongoing training helps ingrain situational awareness and helps get your employees to care about data security. So it serves as a reinforcing message as well. That's why this regular training that you're providing on multiple occasions can help accomplish. Cybersecurity awareness. So this training is the type of training you must provide. While this is not specified in the regulation either, the FFIEC appears to define it as an awareness of cybersecurity risks and mitigating those risks to make your institution's data security stronger. So it's about identifying and solving problems. That's the point of awareness. I also want to point you to some resources that can help you, folks. So the FFIEC has a cybersecurity awareness page that includes a ton of resources that financial institutions can use to inform all sorts of stakeholders. And it'll help you define what you really need to tackle in your internal business training as you try and explain your cybersecurity program or your policies to everybody in the organization. And another less known resource is the Cybersecurity Resource Center, provided by the National Center for the Middle Market out of Ohio State University. I bring this up because they focus only on middle market companies, of which a lot of financial institutions are, and they're going to find it the hardest to meet these regulations. Neither of these sources really help with training, but they may help you in general build just a better cybersecurity program. So I wanted to make sure you guys had that. Training must be updated to address the particular risks identified by your risk assessment. So this seems pretty clear, but it's interesting. What are you supposed to train on if you haven't performed a risk assessment yet? Both training and that risk assessment are due March 1st, 2018. Employee mistakes is the big risk that I want to bring up to you folks. So it's also known as insider negligence. Why? Because employees have been called the greatest risk to cybersecurity. It's because they can't be controlled, and I am one of them, like machine outputs, like your computer systems. Simple things like phishing emails, weak passwords, and not following company policies are things that employees like me and maybe you do often and can compromise these security systems. And nobody's saying it's intentional. It's just human nature. It's what we do. more food for thought. The Ponemon Institute, the federal government, and the Department of Financial Services have all recognized the risk that employees represent when it comes to cybersecurity. So regardless of your program and policies, employees should also be just as attuned. I'm most impressed by the FFIEC quote, the one you see in the middle of your screen. So it describes creating an information security culture where everyone understands their role to help the company. Culture is critically important to any compliance endeavor. It's something we write about a lot. It applies to corruption, it applies to diversity, and I thoroughly believe it applies to cybersecurity. So I urge you to think higher than just what the regulation requires and how you can incorporate cybersecurity really into your whole culture. And I'm going to give you some tips later in the presentation, in the last section. So that's how I interpret the training requirement. And I think we have another poll for you folks.
Great. Yes, this is the second poll of the day. We're just curious because we know that different ways of communicating within the company can have different effects on your people. So we'd like to ask you, at your company, how are compliance issues, critical issues mostly communicated? Is it by email? Is it through policies that, by this we mean, that can be accessed through your electronic resources? So maybe they're on the website or within like the company's intranet, or meetings. You hold meetings to communicate these criticalities, or is it ingrained in the culture, as Douglas was just mentioning? So it's part of the way that your people perceive your organizational values and objectives. So I'm going to open up the poll right now, have you vote, and let us know what's happening over on your end. A lot of people are voting. Thank you so much for that. We really appreciate keeping these events. We like to do these polls both to keep these events interactive for you, but also to provide you with data points that are coming from the other people in the audience, and that it should give you better insight of what's going on within your space. So because I see people still voting, I'm going to give it another 10 seconds, and then I'm going to close it out, Douglas. Sure. And some interesting results there. We're not going to spoil anything for now. So I'm going to close it out. Thanks for those of you who voted, and here are the results.
Oh, this is really interesting. So we have emails and policies being the most popular way to communicate compliance issues to a company. And I think that's great. Two things to really know about emails and policies. So training is very different from both. Email is a form of communication, and that's something that is to be used in tandem with training, but I would not consider email training itself. I've heard a few in-house counsel actually talk about this in this way because they're really pushing to find documentation, a way to prove that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing, but which is good. Documentation is great. Just know that email communication doesn't necessarily mean somebody is learning the content that you send to them. They should, but it's the way adults work. It's likely not possible. And the same with policies. Policies are absolutely necessary and critical. It's your leadership telling the entire company what's important to them. But also know the same with emails. You know, policies aren't effective for learning. That's what the research shows. So when thinking about training, thinking more about meetings and culturally, right? That's sort of like a really good way to ingrain a way to really emphasize company values and how you value cybersecurity. And I'm not here to shame anyone. So many companies really rely on emails and policies because, again, they need that documentation, and it's completely understandable. I'm coming from a training perspective, where I want to ensure employees really understand content and really are really enthusiastic representatives of your company. So thank you for that, folks. And then training best practices. Finally, we have, these are not technically required by the training mandate. The regulation does not force you to have any of these, but we know training and compliance, so we wanted to really give you these tips to help you form a better compliance program. First, starting with context. Context is everything in the world. Everyone at your company, including your board, should understand really three big things. What cybersecurity is and why it's important. I'm sorry, those are two things. What cybersecurity is and why it's important. So the first provides a working definition, and the second provides foundational context to attach learning concepts to. Otherwise, learning operates in a vacuum if they don't have context. What kind of context is important? It should be business-driven and not compliance-driven. I've brought this up before. Making compliance really a business driver will really let the impact sink in. For example, Capgemini is a consulting firm that conducted a survey of 163 security personnel from banks and insurance companies. 21% said that they were highly confident that their organization can detect a cybersecurity breach, meaning that 79% of them were not highly confident that their firm could detect one, even though 74% of financial consumers reported that they would switch banks or insurance companies in the event of a data breach. So what we have is the risk is really high of losing customers from a data breach, but the ability to confidently find data breaches in the system is comparatively really low. I bring this up because it's a way to communicate how important cybersecurity is to your company. A data breach can happen regardless of compliance mandates. It can happen regardless of this regulation. There are real business risks that impact the entire company, and they must be understood by employees, by the board, by the C-suite. Second, another training practice is mere policies don't work. I mentioned this when talking about the poll. You can't throw a policy at an employee and have them sign it and expect them to know it or learn from it. They should, but they don't. Companies should instead think about conduct, behavior, and attitudes. These are more humanistic qualities that we really attach to when we learn. So, for example, conduct training, teaching data security maybe from a conduct perspective, as we've done research and we've shown really big three things. First, when you're instructing adults, they need to be willing to learn. And so this is a big advice for you folks, is if you're rolling out training or you're rolling out this understanding of your program, telling people, oh, we're required to do this by law, oh, we're forced to do this, isn't the best way to effectuate it, right? Because it doesn't give a learner really the sense of importance and how their daily practices are going to affect your cybersecurity program. So that's one advice there. Second, narrative case building. Learning is highly effective. It's the most effective form of learning, according to our research, when conducting e-learning. So I need to be specific about that. And then finally, training must have an immediate practical application. Adults come with them a variety of backgrounds and perspectives. And so they need to be able to apply their background, particularly what they do in their job, and actually do something based on the training. They need an action plan, because otherwise that information just sits there and often won't be utilized. So that's the way training should be focused. It's the best practice. And two more things on that. Engagement. The regulation requires awareness training. That's right there in the language, but awareness is really the lowest expectation in terms of a learning hierarchy. Awareness has nothing to do with engagement, which is really necessary for learning. I can be aware of something and be completely disengaged at the same time. So why do I bring that up? I'm saying that it's your choice to provide awareness training with no ROI and no impact on your employees. But that's really not a good practice, and it's not going to stop a data breach. Mere awareness training, just having people know about the problem, is not going to help an employee identify, address, and help you mitigate security risk. It's just not. You need engagement and consider human behavior when rolling out your training. Finally, culture. Entire law review articles and journal articles have written about culture. So I'm afraid, given our time, I will only have to brush through highlights, which is really doing them a disservice. Culture starts with, you've heard this tone at the top, leadership, needs to be able to espouse your values and what's important to them, so they must say that cybersecurity is important. It should be connected to your values. How can you connect cybersecurity to your values? Many of you have customer service as the top of your value. Communicating cybersecurity as a tenet of your values is a really way to drive home this concept and make employees understand how important it is. Legitimacy refers to fairness. So it refers to, do employees believe you when you roll out a policy? Are you consistent? Do you enforce it? Hopefully you do. That'll make it easier to implement data security throughout your culture. Management are great examples. They can live this compliance aspect, this business, this cybersecurity in their actions, and it shows to other employees, particularly their subordinates, that yes, oh, my manager's doing it, I should too. And the opposite is true. If management doesn't care about cybersecurity, their subordinates aren't, even though it's company policy and you send constant emails about it. That's just the way it works. And then finally, daily practices. People need to know that their daily actions impact cybersecurity. All of these things contribute to culture. So again, I apologize for breezing through these really important concepts, but I think it's really something to think about. And then this leads us to the takeaways. Cybersecurity is really more than this regulation training requirement. Cybersecurity is a business decision. It affects your company regardless of the law. I think you should prepare accordingly. Second, the regulations require training, and while they don't require effectiveness, I think it should be if you want any sort of ROI. Finally, credible sources indicate that employees are the greatest risk to cybersecurity. But if you involve them in your business, use your values, create a culture, they can actually be your best asset in preventing breaches. And those are the takeaways. I hope I gave you some great insights into what the regulation required and also training best practices going forward.
Thank you, Douglas. And so we're coming right at the end of the webinar time. I don't think we'll have time for answering questions live, but if you'd like to just put them in, we'll make sure we reach out to you on a separate basis after the event. I just wanted to bring us to a close here today. Thank you so much, Douglas, for the great presentation. This was an overview of the requirements, but we also wanted to give you a training angle, partly because we're a training company, but secondly, because what really matters in this case, it's not for you to just be compliant, right? Because as we outlined, there's a huge risk out there that carries billions of dollars of potential damage with it. And so what you really want here is to be effective, right? Checking the box is not going to cut it. And so what we have seen over and over is that training is the way to go because studies, and I'm sure the IT people that are on the call today will already know this, and it shows that most data breaches are actually caused by either negligence or some sort of human error within the target organization. And so training your people on how to recognize threats and how not to fall from some of the most common ways that hackers have to getting into your systems can make a huge difference there. And so we talked a little bit about, in general, what we believe in terms of training in this space, but that being said, we do have a course. If you're not familiar with it, the branch of our company that holds the corporate compliance vertical is based in Silicon Valley. So we have actually developed our cybersecurity course with the help of some of the most successful and big tech companies around in the area. And we would love an opportunity to show you around. So if you're still on the call and you're curious to see how we developed our program, and you know, for any reason, albeit just wanting to get some ideas on how to develop it internally, just type demo on the right-hand side of your screen in the question box, and that would signal to us that you're interested. We'll have one of our training experts reach out to you, schedule a brief call, and show you what our courseware looks like, and you know, a lot of the things that Douglas talks about, how do we put them into practice into an effective training program. That being said, we're now just a couple of minutes over time. I see there's pretty much everybody still here, so thank you so much for being with us this far. As mentioned at the beginning, a copy of the slides, which will have, by the way, all the resources that Douglas has hyperlinked. You obviously couldn't click them right now on the live event, but they will be there in your deck that you can save for your personal use. And a full recording of this event will be mailed to you once ready. And I'd also like to mention, when you close this, the GoToWebinar interface out there will be a short poll that initiates. It's our way to collect your feedback on the content today. It just takes 2 to 3 minutes. Very valuable for us. It helps us keep just catering to you events that you actually care for. So if you could just spend those 2 to 3 minutes, let us know what you thought. That's very much appreciated. And one last thank to our presenter today, to all of you who have attended, voted on our polls, and have been with us this far. Stay tuned, because we'll be hosting more of these events in the coming weeks. And thank you very much for being us today from EverFi. Have a great day.